I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
The fog over Lochdub was so thick and white that it felt like being wrapped in a damp, woolen blanket. For PC Hamish Macbeth, this was the finest kind of Highland weather. It was weather that discouraged tourists from asking for directions and, more importantly, discouraged DCI Blair from driving up from Strathbane to check if Hamish was actually doing any police work. Hamish was currently engaged in the delicate task of poaching a salmon from the Tommel Stretch, a piece of river strictly reserved for the wealthy guests of the Halberton Smythe estate. He stood knee-deep in the cold water, his tall, lanky frame nearly invisible against the mist. Beside him, Lugs, his hairy mongrel, sat on the bank with an expression of bored complicity. Just as Hamish felt the satisfying tug of a heavy fish on his line, the peace of the morning was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in the glen. The high-pitched, frantic yapping of a pampered dog, and the shrill, demanding voice of a woman who clearly expected the world to rearrange itself for her convenience. "Fifi! Fifi, darling, come back! This dreadful damp is going to ruin your coat!" Hamish groaned, expertly playing the salmon and landing it with a swift movement. He tucked the fish into his oversized poacher's pocket, just as a woman emerged from the fog like a vengeful spirit in neon lycra. A tiny, shivering poodle wearing a diamond-encrusted collar followed her. The woman was Mrs. Arabella Sterling, a newcomer who had recently purchased the old croft on the hill and spent a small fortune converting it into what she called a holistic Highland retreat. She had thin, arched eyebrows that seemed perpetually surprised and a mouth that looked as though she had been sucking on a very sour lemon. "You there, policeman!" she shrieked, spotting Hamish's peaked cap. "What are you doing standing in the river like a heron? I've been calling the station for 20 minutes. My organic non-GMO seaweed wraps have been tampered with." Hamish waded slowly out of the water, adopting a look of profound, wide-eyed stupidity. He let a bit of river water drip from his sleeve and scratched his ginger head. "Seaweed wraps, is it, mem?" he asked, his Highland drawl becoming twice as thick as usual. "Now, would that be the kind of seaweed the seals eat, or the kind that just washes up on the rocks?" Arabella Sterling recoiled, as if he had suggested she eat a raw haggis. "It is imported, hand-pressed kelp from the Mediterranean, you simpleton. It costs more per ounce than your annual salary. Someone has replaced my supply with common pond scum, and my guest, the Countess of Caithness, is due for her detox at noon." "Pond scum," Hamish repeated thoughtfully. "Well now, the Highland wind can be a terrible thing, mem. It blows all sorts of bits and pieces around. Perhaps it just blew the pond scum right into your jars." The jars were sealed in the sterilized treatment room. Arabella snapped. "This is sabotage, jealousy. These villagers of yours are primitive, Macbeth. They resent my vision. They resent the Spa of Sinmi rebranding of this dreary little town into a centre for luxury indulgence." "The Spa of Sin," Hamish mused, his internal monologue noting that the villagers mostly resented her habit of shouting at them for breathing too loudly near her meditation garden. "It's a grand name, surely. Barry. Descriptive. Don't just stand there gawping. Do something. Investigate. Fingerprint the jars. Fingerprints, mem." Hamish blinked slowly. "I am not sure we have the equipment for that in Lochdub. The last time I checked, the kit was being used to hold up the leg of the sergeant's desk in Strathbane. But I'll tell you what I'll come by later and have a wee look. After I've had my coffee. A man can't see pond scum properly on an empty stomach." Arabella let out a huff of pure outrage, scooped up her shivering dog, and marched back toward the hill, her expensive trainers squelching loudly in the Highland mud. Hamish watched her go, feeling the weight of the salmon in his pocket. He looked at Lugs, who gave a sympathetic wag of his tail. "Luxury indulgence, he says," Hamish whispered, "in a place where the rain can turn a man's bones to ice in 10 minutes. Shall be wanting the midgets to wear silk waistcoats next." He turned and began the walk back to his small police station, already thinking about the pot of strong, black coffee he was going to brew. He had no intention of investigating seaweed. In Lochdub, pond scum was usually a sign of nature taking its course, not a criminal conspiracy. However, as the fog began to lift, revealing the jagged, dark peaks above the village, Hamish felt a familiar, uneasy prickle at the back of his neck. Lochdub was a quiet place, but when outsiders brought their vision and their money, they usually brought something else too. A brand of trouble that couldn't be washed away with an organic seaweed wrap. The poached salmon was safely hidden in the cool larder of the police station, and the first cup of coffee was just beginning to work its magic on Hamish's soul when the telephone shrieked. It was a jarring, insistent sound that seemed to mock the peaceful ticking of the wall clock. Hamish stared at the black receiver for a long moment, hoping it might realize its mistake and fall silent. It did not. With a heavy sigh and a mournful look at his half-finished mug, he picked it up. The voice on the other end was not the sharp, manic trill of Arabella Sterling, but the deep, panicked rumble of Archie McLean, the local handyman who had been bullied into doing the heavy lifting for the new spa of Sin. "Hamish!" "You've got to get up to the Hill House," Archie gasped, the sound of his heavy breathing crackling through the line. "It's the lady, the one with the neon trousers. Shish. Well, she's gone and gotten herself into a right state in the sensory deprivation tank. Is she just having a quiet moment, Archie?" Hamish asked, his voice slow and soothing. The woman did say she wanted peace and tranquility for her guests. Perhaps she's just leading by example. "It's more than a quiet moment, Hamish," Archie whispered, his voice dropping an octave. "She's floating face down. And the water, it isn't salt water anymore. It's thick and green. It looks like someone emptied a whole bog into the machine. I think she's dead, Hamish. Drowned in her own fancy spa." The coffee in Hamish's stomach suddenly felt like lead. He didn't ask any more. He grabbed his peaked cap, whistled for lugs, and headed out into the thinning mist. The walk up to the old croft was steep, and by the time he reached the whitewashed building that now bore a gleaming brass sign reading the Spa of Sin, his breath was coming in short bursts. The front door was wide open, and the scent of expensive eucalyptus was being aggressively overtaken by the pungent, earthy smell of stagnant pond water. Hamish found Archie standing in the doorway of the Zen room, a space filled with polished pebbles and bamboo stalks that looked entirely out of place in the Highlands. In the center of the room sat the sensory deprivation tank, a sleek, futuristic pod made of white fiberglass. The lid was retracted, and inside, the nightmare was visible. Arabella Sterling was indeed floating, her bright lycra outfit a garish contrast to the murky, emerald-green sludge that now filled the tank. Her tiny poodle, Fifi, was sitting on a nearby massage table, howling a thin, ghostly sound that set Hamish's teeth on edge. Hamish approached the tank's edge with a grimace. He didn't need a medical degree to see that the woman was beyond help. Her eyes were wide, fixed in a final expression of indignant surprise, as if she were about to lodge a formal complaint with the Reaper himself. What struck Hamish, however, wasn't just the body, but the nature of the water. It was thick with duckweed, bits of rotted heather, and the unmistakable slime of a highland peat bog. It was as if the pond scum she had complained about earlier had decided to finish the job. Lugs wandered over to the tank, gave a single, skeptical sniff, and then retreated to a corner to sit with his back to the scene. Hamish knelt, his hazel eyes scanning the fiberglass rim. There were no signs of a struggle, no muddy boot prints on the pristine white florinley, a single, small twig of bog myrtle floating near Arabella's manicured hand. It was a bizarre, almost ritualistic sight. Someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to transport gallons of filthy bog water into a sterilized medical facility. "Did you see anyone leaving, Archie?" Hamish asked softly, not looking up from the tank. "No one," Archie replied, his cap clutched tightly in his hands. "I was out back fixing the generator. The Countess was supposed to arrive at noon, so I came in to check the heaters. That's when I found her." Hamish stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the green water. He felt a wave of genuine annoyance wash over him. A murder in Lochdub was always a tragedy, but a murder involving an outsider and a vat of peat was going to bring the Strathbane police down on the village like a swarm of angry midgets. He could already hear the sirens in his mind, and with them the inevitable roar of DCI Blair. The peace of the morning was officially dead, drowned in a luxury tank of Highland mud. The high-pitched wail of police sirens began to echo off the steep granite walls of the glen, signalling the end of any remaining peace in Lochdub. Hamish Macbeth stood by the window of the Zen room, watching two white police rovers tear up the gravel driveway of the Spa of Sin with an aggression that suggested they were charging a fortress rather than a wellness retreat. Lugs let out a low, mournful cry, retreating further into the shadows of the bamboo deka. Hamish adjusted his cap, smoothing his ginger hair with a weary hand, and prepared himself for the inevitable storm. The front door slammed open with enough force to rattle the expensive glass partitions. Detective Chief Inspector Blair marched in, his face already a dangerous shade of magenta that nearly matched the neon lycra of the deceased. Behind him trailed Detectives Anderson and Higgins, both looking as though they had been dragged out of a warm pub and were nursing a collective grudge against the entire Highland postal code. Blair didn't stop to offer a greeting. He stomped directly into the treatment room, his heavy boots squeaking offensively on the pristine white floor. Macbeth! Blair bellowed, his voice vibrating in the small, humid space. What in the name of all that is holy is going on here? I get a call about a drowning in a bathtub, and I find you standing around looking like a lost sheep in a flower shop. Is this the body? Hamish stepped back, adopting his most vacant and subservient expression. It is, sir. Mrs. Arabella Sterling. She appears to have... well, she's gotten herself tangled up in the sensory tank, Mr. Blair. Blair leaned over the edge of the pod, his nose wrinkling in immediate disgust as the scent of stagnant peat hit him. Tangled. She looks like she's been marinated in a sewer. What is this green muck? Don't tell me these trendy types are paying for this. It's bog water, sir, Hamish offered mildly, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic Highland drawl. Pure Highland peat and duckweed. Mrs. Sterling was very particular about her organic treatments, but I don't think she intended for the tank to be filled with the bottom of the Black Loch. Blair whirled around, jabbing a thick, nicotine-stained finger toward the trembling Archie McLean, who was still clutching his cap by the door. And who's this? The local muscle? The one who decided to give the lady a permanent mud bath? That's just Archie, sir, Hamish said quickly. He's the handyman. He's the one who found her and called it in. Handyman, eh? Blair sneered, walking a slow, predatory circle around the terrified Archie. Handy with a bucket, ill bet. Handy with a grudge against a wealthy Englishwoman who probably didn't pay her bills on time. Look at his hands, Anderson, covered in grease and dirt, the same kind of filth that's floating in that tank. It's just engine oil, sir, Archie wailed, his eyes wide with panic. I was fixing the generator. I never touched the lady, I swear on the Bible. Save it for the station, you bumpkin, Blair barked. It's a classic case of class resentment. The local peasant revolts against the gentrification of his village by drowning the landlord in her own luxury pond. It's poetic. It's open and shut. Higgins, get the cuffs. We'll have a confession out of him before the sun sets over the heather. Hamish watched with a sinking heart as Higgins moved toward Archie. If I might just mention, sir, Hamish murmured, looking down at his own scuffed boots. Archie here was working on the generator at the back of the house. To fill that tank with that much bog water would take dozens of trips with a heavy bucket. The floor here is perfectly dry, Mr. Blair. Not a drop of spilled water between here and the door. It's almost as if the water was pumped in through the filtration system itself. Blair turned on Hamish, his eyes narrowing into piggish slits. Are you trying to tell me how to do my job, Macbeth? Are you suggesting this was some high-tech plumbing accident? I don't pay you to have theories. I pay you to stay out of the way while the real police handle the heavy lifting. This man was on the premises. He had the opportunity, and he clearly lacks the moral fibre of a civilized citizen. Now, take that flea-bitten mongrel of yours and go stand outside. Secure the perimeter. And if you see a journalist, keep your mouth shut, or ill have you transferred to a traffic beat in the centre of Glasgow, so fast your head will spin. Hamish bowed his head, the picture of a defeated, slow-witted constable. Yes, sir. Whatever you say, Mr. Blair. I'll just be outside, securing things. As he whistled for lugs and walked out into the cool, damp air, Hamish's internal monologue was far from slow. He knew Archie hadn't done it. The man didn't have the imagination, let alone the cold-blooded patience required to bypass a high-end filtration system. Someone else had known exactly how that spa operated, and they had wanted Arabella Sterling to die in a way that mocked her very existence. Blair was chasing a phantom, which meant it was up to Hamish to start mooching around the village and listening to the things people weren't saying. Hamish walked away from the spa of sin with the sound of Blair's shouting still ringing in his ears. The DCI was busy terrifying Archie McLean, which meant the village was momentarily free of the real police. This was Hamish's favourite time for an investigation, the time when he could move through Lockdub like a ghost, appearing to do nothing while absorbing everything. He whistled for Lugs, who trotted along with a newfound spring in his step, happy to be away from the sterile, eucalyptus-scented death trap on the hill. Their first stop was the harbour, where the salt air was thick enough to chew and the local gossip was usually fresher than the morning's catch. He found Mrs. Gallagher, the postmistress, standing outside the grocery shop with a bundle of letters clutched to her chest. Her eyes were bright with a predatory curiosity that suggested she had already calculated the exact volume of bog water needed to drown a spa owner. Hamish slowed his pace, leaning against a rusted lamppost and looking out at the bobbing fishing boats with a vacant, sleepy expression. Dreadful business, Mrs. Gallagher, Hamish sighed, scratching his jaw. The Highlands just aren't as peaceful as they used to be. All that fancy mud and neon trousers. It's a heavy price to pay for a bit of luxury. Luxury, Hamish, Mrs. Gallagher snorted, her voice a sharp rasp. That woman was a walking disaster. Did you know Shed already sent 3 formal complaints to the council about the smell of the fish market? Said it was interfering with the aromatic integrity of her meditation garden, as if the sea hasn't smelled like fish since the beginning of time. Is that a fact? Hamish asked, his voice dropping into its most gullible register. Well now, she was very particular about her smells. She was complaining to me just this morning about her seaweed being replaced with pond scum. She seemed to think the whole village was against her. Mrs. Gallagher leaned in, her voice dropping to a confidential hiss. The village wasn't against her. Hamish. The village ignored her. But her partners? That's a different story. There was a man visiting her last Tuesday, a flashy fellow in a suit that cost more than a cottage. They were arguing out on the veranda. He was shouting about returns on investment, and she was screaming that he couldn't fire her from her own dream. He left in such a hurry he nearly ran over my cat. Hamish nodded slowly, filing the information away. An angry investor with a suit was exactly the kind of detail Blair would ignore in favour of a local handyman. But there was more. He moved on from Mrs. Gallagher and headed toward the Lochdub Hotel, where Mrs. Patel was busy polishing the brass knocker on the front door. She looked up as Hamish approached, her face a mask of weary disapproval. "The police from Strathbane are a plague, Hamish," she declared, not waiting for him to speak. "They've already been in here demanding coffee for free and shouting at my staff. That man Blair, he has no manners. He thinks because he has a badge, he can treat us like we're part of a criminal gang. He's a very busy man, Mrs. Patel," Hamish said, looking longingly at the hotel kitchen door. "He don't have time for the finer points of conversation. But tell me, did you see anyone else staying here who might have been interested in Mrs. Sterling's little spa? Perhaps someone who didn't like the way she was running things." Mrs. Patel paused her polishing, her eyes narrowing. There was a young woman. A therapist, she called herself. Came here to work for Mrs. Sterling, but they had a falling out on the very first day. The girl was crying in the lobby, saying Arabella had stolen her proprietary formulas for the secret peat wraps. She said Arabella was a fraud who didn't know the difference between healing salts and table salt. Hamish took a slow sip of the tea Mrs. Patel had finally produced from behind the desk. "A fraud, you say? That's a hard word for a woman who was trying to bring wellness to the Glen." "She was bringing nothing but trouble," Mrs. Patel replied. "And that young woman she left yesterday. But I saw her car parked up by the old quarry road this morning. The one that leads right to the back of the spa's filtration shed. A little blue hatchback it was." Hamish thanked her and retreated into the cool air. The picture was shifting. Behind the neon lycra and the aromatic eucalyptus, there were stolen formulas, angry investors, and secret roads. Archie McLean might have been the one on the premises, but he wasn't the one with a reason to turn a luxury tank into a peat bog. Hamish felt a familiar weight in his pockethe poached salmon. He'd need to get that home before it started to smell, but first he had a date with a certain blonde aristocrat who always knew the dirty laundry of the upper classes. It was time to visit Priscilla. The path to the Halberton Smythe estate was slick with the afternoon's persistent drizzle, turning the fine gravel into a grey slurry that clung to Hamish's boots. He walked with a deceptive slouch, his hands deep in his pockets, while his mind methodically sorted through the fragments of village gossip he had gathered. Mrs. Patel's mention of a blue hatchback near the quarry road sat uncomfortably alongside Mrs. Gallagher's account of the shouting investor. It was a tangle of high finance frustration and professional jealousy, and in the Highlands, such things usually ended in a damp, messy catastrophe. Luggs trotted ahead, his tail a sodden plume, occasionally stopping to sniff at a clump of sodden heather, as if he too was searching for a misplaced clue in the peat. Hamish found Priscilla Halberton Smythe in the stables, her golden hair pulled back into a sensible ponytail as she brushed down her favourite mare. The scent of hay and horsehide was a welcome relief from the cloying eucalyptus and stagnant bog water of the Spa of Sin. Priscilla looked up as Hamish approached, her cool blue eyes taking in his unkempt appearance and the slight bulge in his pocket, where the poached salmon still resided. She didn't ask why he was there in Lochdub. The police constable only moved this purposefully when a disaster had occurred or when he was hiding a fish. "I hear the village's attempt at enlightenment has ended in a rather muddy tragedy." "Hamish," Priscilla said, her voice smooth and devoid of the frantic energy that usually characterized the locals. "The grapevine says Arabella Sterling has taken a final, very permanent dip in her own sensory tank." Hamish sighed, leaning against the wooden stable door, while Luggs collapsed onto a pile of dry straw. DCI Blair is currently trying to fit Archie McLean for a pair of handcuffs, convinced it's a peasant uprising. But the water in that tank didn't get there by bucket, Priscilla. It was a professional job, or at least very knowledgeable. Someone bypassed the filters entirely. Priscilla paused her brushing, her expression becoming thoughtful. Arabella was never popular in the social circles she so desperately tried to cultivate. She was a woman who built her dreams on the backs of others. My father mentioned she had secured her initial funding through a rather aggressive partnership with a London firm, Sterling Vane. The Vane part of that equation is a man named Julian Vane, a venture capitalist with a reputation for stripping assets and a very short fuse when it comes to delayed profits. Hamish straightens, his hazel eyes sharpening. "Julian Vane, you say?" Mrs. Gallagher saw a man in a flashy suit arguing with her last week, shouting about returns on investment. It seems Arabella's vision was costing him more than he was willing to lose. "There's more," Priscilla added, stepping out of the stall and wiping her hands on a cloth. "The young therapist Mrs. Patel mentioned her name is Elspeth Ross. She's the daughter of a local crofter from over near Drim. She's brilliant with herbology, but she's also incredibly proud. She told me months ago that Arabella had tricked her into signing over the rights to a specific peat-based enzyme treatment. It's a treatment that requires a very specific pH balance and a specialized pumping system to keep it from clogging the machinery. If you wanted to sabotage a spa like that, Elspeth is the only person in the county who would know exactly which valve to turn to flood the system with raw bog water." Hamish let out a long whistle. "So we have an investor who wanted her out of the way for the insurance or the land, and a disgraced employee who knew exactly how to turn the luxury tank into a watery grave. It's a messy business, Priscilla. It's a Highland business, Hamish," she replied, leaning against the stable wall. "Arabella thought she could buy the atmosphere of the Glen and sell it back to people in jars. She didn't realize that the Glen has a way of reclaiming its own. You should look into the blue hatchback, but keep an eye on the investor. Men like Julian Vane don't come to Lochdub to enjoy the view, they come to collect what they think they are owed." "You've a sharp mind for the dirty laundry of the gentry," Hamish said with a small, grateful smile. He knew he had the pieces now, but he needed a way to prove which hand had turned the valve before Blair dragged poor Archie off to a cell in Strathbane. The drizzle was turning into a steady downpour, mirroring the dark undercurrent of the mystery. He needed to find that blue hatchback and see if Elspeth Ross was still in the area, or if she had merely provided the technical expertise for a much more cold-blooded killer. The rain had transitioned from a light highland mist into a relentless grey downpour by the time Hamish trudged back toward the village. The wind whipped around the corners of the police station, whistling through the eaves as if mocking the frantic activity within. As Hamish stepped through the door, the heavy scent of wet wool and floor wax hit him, and the sound of DCI Blair's voice, booming with misplaced triumph, filled the small hallway. Blair was standing in the centre of the office, his chest puffed out so far that the buttons on his waistcoat looked ready to surrender. He was waving a pair of handcuffs at a weeping Archie McLean, while Anderson and Higgins stood by like bored sentinels. "It's over, you miserable little cold," Blair roared, his face a shade of plum that suggested his blood pressure was reaching critical levels. "We found the motive. You wanted the land back for your sheep, didn't you? You hated the posh lady and her fancy towels, so you decided to give her a permanent mud bath. We've found a witness who saw you lugging heavy containers toward the filtration shed last night. It's open and shut. Get him in the van." Hamish stood in the doorway, his tall, lanky frame dripping water onto the linoleum. He adopted a look of wide-eyed, vacant bewilderment, scratching his ginger head with a slow, deliberate motion. "Now, Mr. Blair, sir," Hamish began, his Highland drawl becoming thick and syrupy. "Are you sure about the containers? It's a terribly long way to be carrying buckets of bog water in the dark, and Archie here has a very bad back from that fall off the Kirk roof 3 years ago." Blair whirled around, his small, piddish eyes narrowing with pure venom. "Macbeth! I told you to secure the perimeter, not to come back here and offer medical opinions on a murderer. I have a witness, a reliable local who saw him near the shed. What more do you want? A signed confession in blood?" "Well now, sir," Hamish said mildly, stepping closer to the desk where Blair had dumped a pile of evidence. "It's just that I found something a bit odd when I was mooching about the stables earlier. I went back up to the spa just to check the lock on the gate, and I saw something caught in the teeth of the intake valve. It's a bit of a mystery to a simple man like myself." Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, translucent object. He held it up to the lighter, tiny blue plastic bead, the kind used in cheap costume jewelry or perhaps as a decorative element on a keychain. "It was jammed right in the mechanism, sir. It seems it's what caused the filter to seize up and let the raw peat through. Now, I know Archie's a rough sort of fellow, but I've never known him to wear blue beads. Blair snatched the bead from Hamish's hand, squinting at it with a look of profound irritation. A bead? You're interrupting a major arrest because of a bit of plastic? It's probably from one of those New Age necklaces the Sterling woman wore. It proves nothing. Oh, I'm sure you're right, sir, Hamish said, his voice dropping into a humble murmur. But the odd thing is, I saw a young woman earlier one who used to work for Mrs. Sterling, Elspeth Ross. She had a keychain with a whole string of these beads on it, and she drives a blue hatchback, the same one Mrs. Patel saw parked up by the quarry road this morning. I suspect she might have been the one the witness saw, not poor Archie. Blair froze, the mention of a new suspect and a specific vehicle momentarily stalling his ego. A blue hatchback. Why wasn't I told about this? Why are you just standing there like a statue while a suspect is fleeing the scene? I was just getting to that, sir, Hamish lied smoothly. But then I thought, if Elspeth was there, she'd know exactly how to pump that water in without ever carrying a bucket. She was the one who designed the system, after all. But then I noticed something else on the bead. It isn't just blue plastic. It's got a tiny trace of very expensive silver paint on it. The kind they use on high-end luxury cars. The kind that doesn't belong on a local girl's hatchback. Blair looked at the bead again, his frustration mounting. Silver paint. What are you talking about, Macbeth? I don't know, sir, Hamish said, looking suitably confused. I am just a village policeman, but it reminded me of that flashy car I saw earlier, the one belonging to the investor from London. Mr. Julian Vane. His car was parked right next to the filtration shed when I arrived. I wonder if he might have bumped into the valve while he was investigating. Blair's face shifted through several shades of red before settling on a grim, calculating pale. He hated being corrected, but the mention of a wealthy London investor and forensic evidence was a siren song to a man who lived for headlines. He shoved the bead into an evidence bag and pointed a finger at Hamish. You! Stay here with the prisoner, Anderson Higgins, with me. We're going to have a word with Mr. Vane, and if you've led me on a wild goose chase, Macbeth, he'll have your badge for breakfast. As the heavy doors slammed shut and the sirens faded into the distance, Hamish let out a long breath. He looked at the trembling Archie and gave a small, reassuring nod. Don't you worry, Archie. Mr. Blair is just having one of his moments. Why don't you go to the kitchen and put the kettle on? I think we both could use a strong cup of tea. Hamish sat back in his chair, his internal monologue far from sleepy. The bead was a red herring, taken it from a decorative cushion in the spa's lobby, but it had served its purpose. It had stopped Blair from making a catastrophic mistake and pointed him toward the real rot. But Hamish knew silver paint was no car. It was from a very specific type of specialized industrial sealant used in high-end plumbing, and there was only one person in the village who had been seen near the hardware store yesterday afternoon. The trap was almost set. The station house fell into a heavy, watchful silence once the roar of DCI Blair's car faded into the relentless drumming of the Highland rain. Archie McLean sat huddled by the stove, his hands trembling around a mug of tea, while Hamish stood by the window, staring out at the grey, shifting curtains of water. The blue bead was a convenient fiction, a bit of stagecraft to keep Blair from dragging an innocent man to Strathbane, but the silver trace was real. Hamish had seen it on the rim of the filtration intake, not paint, but a high-grade industrial sealant used to bypass the safety sensors of the tank. It was a technical solution to a very human problem, and it suggested a motive far more petty and personal than the grand financial schemes of Julian Vane. Hamish's mind drifted back to a detail he had nearly overlooked during his mooching. While leaning against the lamp-post by the harbour, he had seen the local plumber, Billy Forsyth, unloading a crate of supplies. Billy was a man who prided himself on being the only person in Lochstub who understood modern pressurized systems, and he had been vocally bitter about Arabella Sterling hiring an expert firm from Inverness to install the spa's equipment. But Billy wasn't a killer, he was a craftsman with a bruised ego. There was, however, someone else who had been spending a great deal of time in Billy's workshop lately, ostensibly to learn the trade after being sacked from the local council. Archie, Hamish said softly, not turning from the window. When you were up at the spa this morning, before you found the lady, did you happen to see the post? Or maybe the grocery delivery? Archie blinked, trying to clear the fog of terror from his mind. The groceries came early. Hamish. That young lad from the village store, Peter. He was arguing with Mrs. Sterling by the back door. She was shouting that the local produce wasn't vibrant enough for her guests. She threw a raspberry punnet right at his chest. I saw him walking back to his van, looking like he wanted to burn the whole hill down. Hamish nodded slowly. Peter was a quiet lad, the kind who was easily overlooked, but he was also Elspeth Ross' younger brother. The connection tightened in Hamish's mind like a well-thrown lariat. Elspeth had the technical knowledge of the peat enzymes, and Peter had the access and the simmering resentment of a boy mocked by a wealthy outsider. But as Hamish turned the pieces over, he realized the sabotage wasn't meant to be lethal. Filling a tank with bog water was a prank, a way to humiliate the woman and ruin her aromatic integrity. So why was Arabella Sterling dead? The hidden motive lay not in the water itself, but in what the water replaced. Hamish remembered the scent in the Zen room. It wasn't just peat. There had been a sharp, chemical undertone, like the smell of a cleaning fluid that hadn't been properly rinsed. If someone had known the sabotage was coming, they could have added something else to the tank, something colourless and odourless that would turn a harmless prank into a suffocating trap. "I have to go back up there, Archie," Hamish said, reaching for his heavy, waterproof coat. "Stay here and keep the door locked. If Blair comes back, tell him I've gone to check on a suspicious sighting near the Black Loch. It'll keep him busy for at least an hour." Whistling for lugs, Hamish stepped out into the deluge. The walk back up the hill was grueling, the wind trying its best to push him back toward the village. He avoided the main drive, taking the narrow sheep path that led to the rear of the filtration shed. There, tucked under a heavy tarpaulin, he found what he was looking for, an empty canister of industrial-grade nitrogen. In a confined space like a sensory tank, a sudden release of nitrogen would displace the oxygen in seconds. Arabella wouldn't have drowned in the peat, she would have simply lost consciousness and slipped beneath the surface without a struggle. The bog water was the perfect cover a local crime that pointed directly at the vengeful villagers, while the real killer watched from the sidelines. Hamish crouched low, his eyes scanning the muddy ground. There were no flashy investors' footprints here, and no blue beads. Instead, there was a single, deep impression of an expensive, thin-soled dress, shoe kind worn by someone who didn't expect to be walking in the Highlands. It wasn't Julian Vane's shoe. Vane was too arrogant to do his own dirty work. It was the shoe of someone who stood to gain everything if Arabella died before the partnership was dissolved. Samayon, who knew that with Arabella gone, the Spa of Sin and its lucrative land would fall entirely into their hands. The motive was greed, polished to a high sheen and hidden behind a mask of professional concern. Hamish stood up, the rain lashing his face, and knew he had to set a trap that would force a very clever person to make a very stupid mistake. The rain continued to hammer against the corrugated iron roof of the filtration shed, creating a rhythmic, deafening roar that masked Hamish's movements. He stood over the empty nitrogen canister, his mind clicking through the social hierarchy of the Spa of Sin like a card player calculating the odds. Julian Vane was too loud, too obvious, and far too preoccupied with his own reflection to understand the delicate plumbing of a sensory tank. Elspeth Ross and her brother Peter were motivated by a righteous Highland anger, but their goal was humiliation, not homicide. They wanted the Sassenach woman to look like a fool, not a corpse. The real killer was someone who had watched the prank unfold and seen a golden opportunity to turn a soggy joke into a fatal asset grab. Hamish knelt in the mud, his long fingers tracing the outline of the expensive dress shoe print Head found. It wasn't just any shoe, it was a bespoke Italian loafer, the kind favoured by those who wanted to look like they belonged in a city boardroom, even while standing in a peat bog. There was only one person currently in Lochdub who wore such footwear and had the keys to every door in the building. The Spa's business manager, Marcus Thorne. Marcus had played the part of the loyal, overworked subordinate to perfection, but Hamish had noticed the way Marcus looked at the accounts when Arabella wasn't watching, with the hunger of a man who was tired of being a servant to a madwoman's whims. Right then, lugs, Hamish whispered, the dog shivering beside him. "It's time we played a bit of a game with Mr. Thorne. A man like that won't confess to a useless policeman, but hell jump at the chance to save his own skin if he thinks the walls are closing in." Hamish didn't head for the main house. Instead, he made his way back to the village, stopping briefly at the hardware store to borrow a specific piece of equipment from Billy Forsyth. By the time he returned to the Spa of Sin, the light was beginning to fail, casting long, jagged shadows across the sensory room. He found Marcus Thorne in the lobby, looking pale but composed, sipping a glass of mineral water, while Blair's officers were busy elsewhere. "Ah, Macbeth," Marcus said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "I heard DCI Blair has taken the local handyman into custody. A tragic business, truly. Arabella was. Difficult, but she didn't deserve to end like that." Hamish slumped into a designer chair, looking thoroughly defeated, and more than a little dim-witted. He let his wet cap drip onto the expensive rug and gave a heavy, theatrical sigh. "It's a terrible mess, Mr. Thorne. A terrible mess. But the trouble is, Blair is starting to get cold feet. He's worried that the bog water defense won't hold up in court. He started talking about gas, nitrogen specifically." Marcus' hand paused mid-air, the glass of water trembling almost imperceptibly. "Nitrogen? That seems a bit far-fetched for a village grudge, don't you think?" "Oh, I agree with you, sir," Hamish said, leaning forward and lowering his voice to a confidential whisper. "But the forensic boys from Strathbane are on their way back with a new sensor. They say it can detect nitrogen residue in the lungs, even after 24 hours. And the worst part is, they found a canister hidden under a tarp out back. It's got a very clear set of fingerprints on the valve." Marcus set the glass down on a glass-top table with a sharp clack. "Fingerprints? In this rain? High-tech stuff, sir," Hamish lied cheerfully, scratching his ginger head. "They use lasers now, or so I am told. But here's the thing, Blair thinks the canister belongs to that investor, Mr. Vane. He's convinced Vane brought it from London to finish Arabella off. He's planning to arrest Vane at the hotel in an hour. But invorit, Mr. Torner. If Vane didn't do it, hell sue the police for every penny we have. The whole department will be ruined." Hamish stood up, looking pleadingly at the manager. "I've hidden the canister in the old pump room for now, just to give myself time to think. I told Blair I lost the key. If someone were to take that canister and drop it into the deep part of the loch tonight, the whole gas theory would go away, and we could all go back to blaming the bog water. It's better for the village, better for everyone." Marcus stared at Hamish, his eyes darting toward the door leading to the pump room. He saw a way to destroy the only evidence that linked the prank to a murder and pin the whole thing on a local idiot or a rival investor. He saw a stupid policeman offering him a lifeline. "You're a sensible man, Macbeth," Marcus said, his voice tight. "A very sensible man. Perhaps I should go and help you find that key. We wouldn't want DCI Blair making a fool of himself, would we?" "Exactly, sir," Hamish murmured, a small, cold smile hidden in the shadows. "The pump room is just at the end of the hall. I'll go and make sure the back gate is open for you, just in case you want to take a little drive to the loch." As Marcus hurried toward the back of the building, his expensive loafers clicking urgently on the tile, Hamish whistled low for lugs. The bait had been swallowed whole. Now all Hamish had to do was wait in the dark for the moment the loyal manager tried to dispose of the ghost that was about to haunt him. The rain had slowed to a treacherous, icy drizzle by the time Marcus Thorne reached the heavy iron door of the pump room. The building was an auxiliary structure, hidden behind a screen of dripping rhododendrons, where the roar of the main generator drowned out the smaller sounds of the Highland night. Marcus fumbled with his keys, his breath coming in sharp, visible plumes. He was no longer the composed, urbane manager. His expensive hair was plastered to his forehead, and his tailored jacket was darkened by the wet. He swung the door open, the hinges screaming in a way that made him flinch, and stepped into the humid, oil-scented darkness of the facility. "Macbeth?" he called out, his voice thin and strained against the thrum of the machinery. "Where have you put it?" "I don't have all night to play scavenger hunt in the basement." There was no answer, only the steady, rhythmic slosh of water moving through the massive pipes. Marcus pulled a small silver torch from his pocket, its beam cutting a jagged path through the gloom. He swept the light over the concrete floor, past the bubbling filtration vats and the tangled nests of electrical cables, until it landed on a heavy, cylindrical shape tucked behind a stack of chlorine drums. It was the nitrogen canister, its metallic surface gleaming with a dull, malevolent light. He moved toward it with a frantic, stumbling gait, his polished loafers slipping on the slick floor. As he reached out to grasp the cold metal handle, a tall, shadowy figure detached itself from the darkness of the far corner. Lugs let out a single, low growl that vibrated through the floorboards, and the beam of a much more powerful police lantern suddenly illuminated Marcus' terrified face. "I wouldn't touch that, if I were you, mister." "Thorne," Hamish said, his voice echoing with a calm, resonant authority that was entirely missing from his earlier, bumbling performance. "It's a heavy thing, and the mud outside is terribly slippery tonight. You might just find yourself taking a tumble into the black loch along with it." Marcus froze, his hand inches from the canister. He blinked rapidly against the glare of the light, his jaw working but no sound emerging. "Macbeth, you said you wanted this to go away. You said we were helping the village. I say a lot of things when I am mooching about, sir," Hamish replied, stepping into the circle of light. He looked older, sharper, his hazel eyes fixed on the manager with a cold, piercing intensity. but I never much cared for people who use a boy's prank to commit a cold-blooded murder. Young Peter Ross wanted to embarrass his boss. He wanted to turn her fancy spa into a bog for an hour, but he didn't want her dead. You, on the other hand, saw him messing with the valves yesterday. You knew exactly what was coming, and you knew that if Arabella died in a tank full of peat, everyone would blame the angry locals. You have no proof, Marcus hissed, his voice regaining some of its urban arrogance even as his knees began to shake. A canister in a pump room? Any of the staff could have put it here. Vane could have put it here. You're just a village policeman with a vivid imagination. It's a grand imagination, surely, Hamish agreed, nodding slowly. But the thing about nitrogen is that it leaves a very specific kind of frostbite on the valve if it's released too quickly in a humid room. And that expensive Italian loafer of yours, well, it's got a very distinct tread pattern, Mr. Thorne. I found a perfect match right next to the intake vent this afternoon, and I suspect that if I check the glove box of your car, I'll find the specialized wrench used to crack the seal on this particular canister. The one Billy Forsyth says went missing from his shop yesterday. Marcus let out a sharp, hysterical laugh and lunged, not for the canister, but for a heavy iron spanner lying on the workbench. He swung it with the desperate, uncoordinated strength of a man who had reached the end of his tether. Hamish didn't flinch. He stepped inside the arc of the swing, his large, calloused hand catching Marcus' wrist in a grip that felt like a band of heated iron. With a deft, fluid twist, Hamish forced the manager's arm behind his back, pinning him against the cold, vibrating side of a filtration vat. "It's over, Marcus," Hamish whispered, his face inches from the manager's. "The land is beautiful, but it wasn't worth a woman's life. You thought you were the smartest man in the glen, but you forgot that the Highlands have a way of seeing right through a man like you." The spanner clattered to the floor, echoing loudly in the cramped space. Marcus slumped, the fight draining out of him as the reality of the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists finally took hold. He began to weep then, a quiet, pathetic sound that was drowned out by the steady, unfeeling drone of the pumps. Hamish stood back, looking down at the broken man with a mixture of pity and profound, weary disgust. He had his killer, but as always, the piece of lockdub felt like it had been bought with a very dirty coin. The icy rain had finally tapered off into a weary drizzle by the time DCI Blair's Rover screeched back into the station lot, its tires spitting gravel like gunfire. Inside the station, Hamish sat by the peat stove, looking every bit the exhausted, slow-witted constable. He was nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee, his ginger hair wild and damp, while Marcus Thorne sat slumped in a corner chair, cuffed and staring at the floor with the hollow eyes of a man who had seen his future vanish into a Highland bog. Blair slammed the door open, his face a vibrant shade of violet. He had spent the last 2 hours chasing Julian Vane's silver car halfway to Inverness, only to find the investor had a rock-solid alibi involving a very public dinner with the chief constable's cousin. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice rattling the windows, "I ought to have your hide for that wild goose chase. Vane was nowhere near the filtration shed. If this is your idea of he stopped mid-sentence, his piggish eyes bulging as they landed on the shivering manager and the heavy nitrogen canister sitting prominently on the evidence desk. Hamish looked up with a start, nearly dropping his mug. "Ah, Mr. Blair, sir. You're back. I am so sorry about the car, sir. I must have misread the map. But look what happened while you were away. It's the most extraordinary thing." Blair marched over to Thorne, hovering over him like a vengeful cloud. "What is this, Macbeth? Why is Thorne in irons?" "Well, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, humble drawl, "I was just sitting here, feeling terrible about leading you astray, when Mr. Thorne came bursting in. He was carrying that heavy tank and crying his eyes out. He said he couldn't live with the guilt a moment longer. He said your brilliant questioning earlier the way you looked right through him in the lobbyet broke his spirit, sir. He realized he couldn't hide his nitrogen plan from a detective of your caliber." Blair blinked, his chest beginning to swell with its usual, misplaced pride. "My question, you say?" He confessed to the gas. "Aye, sir." Every word, Hamish lied smoothly, looking down at his boots to hide the glint in his eyes. "He said you were like a bloodhound on a scent. He was so terrified of you finding the frostbite on the valves that he tried to dump the evidence. I just happened to be standing by the door when he tripped over lugs. I didn't do a thing, sir. It was all your groundwork that did the heavy lifting." Blair puffed out his chest so far a button audibly strained. "I knew it. I told Anderson there was something shifty about the manager's eyes, a cold, calculating gaze. It takes a seasoned veteran to crack a man like Thorne." He turned to his subordinates, who were trailing in behind him. "Did you hear that?" The suspect couldn't handle the pressure of my investigation. Get him in the van! And get that canister to the lab. I'll write the press release on the way back to Strathbane. A press release, sir? That'll be a grand read, Hamish said, touching his cap. I'm sure the superintendent will be very impressed. They'll likely want to promote you to commander for a catch like this. A city post, maybe? Somewhere with lots of meetings and very little rain? Blair's face momentarily clouded at the thought of more paperwork, but the lure of glory won out. Quite right, Macbeth. Quite right. At least someone in this village recognizes talent. As for you, stay out of trouble. Try not to poach any more fish while I am busy saving your district. As the sirens faded once more into the distance, taking the chaos and the noise with them, the station returned to its blessed, ancient silence. Hamish let out a long, shuddering breath and reached for the pot of stew simmering on the back of the stove. He poured a bowl for himself and a smaller one for Lugs, who began to eat with uncharacteristic gusto. The Lochdub village was quiet again. The Spa of Sin would likely be sold off to a more sensible owner, the nitrogen theory would be hailed as a triumph of Blair's intuition, and Hamish Macbeth would remain exactly where he wanted to be, in a drafty station house with a dog, a stove, and no promotion in sight. He sat by the window, watching the moon finally break through the clouds, reflecting off the dark, still waters of the loch. The Highlands had reclaimed their own, the outsider's vision had been washed away, and the peace bought with a bit of clever deception and a lot of Highland silencers restored. Hamish took a sip of his stew, leaned back, and closed his eyes. It was a good night to be a useless policeman.